And welcome to How the Global Drinks Business Works with me, Philip Duff. You can follow me on Twitter on @Philip Duff, that's @PhilipDuff, or on Instagram at Philip S. Duff, that's PhilipSduff. But why on earth would you want to follow me? Well, this is the seminar of all the many hundreds I've given in 30 or 40 countries all around the world that is the most listened to, the most demanded, the most downloaded about 50,000 times. So I thought it might be time to update it for 2022 and put it out there on a YouTube, maybe on a podcast. If you're watching this, there'll be some visuals. I'm going to try and describe them if you happen to be listening to this podcast style while you're doing something else, cleaning the kitchen, making a cocktail, sitting on the toilet, whatever it might be. If you're a lifer in the drinks industry, I hope this will still be interesting for you because we're going to have a case study of a scrappy little startup company you might have heard of called Diageo to exemplify where the rest of the drinks industry is at right now. We're not just poking fun at Diageo, but we will be doing a bit of that as well. All right, well, I think it's time to go off the races, don't you? The world drinks. It drinks wine, it drinks beer, and it drinks spirits. This presentation is going to be tipped towards spirits, but it's relevant for all kinds of alcoholic beverages. And what's happening in the last couple of decades is that spirits have started on an upward ascent. It used to be that they were wildly outsold by beer and wine, but that has been changing for a while now. In fact, within the incubator unit of the world's largest drinks company, AB InBev, they've actually got specialist units called Spirits Attack and Wine Attack to try and claw back some of the sales that are stolen from beer every year by spirits. Both wine and beer lose market share to spirits every year, and it's been going that way for about the last 2 decades. And it's worth saying, spirits, wine and beer too, are not a trivial thing. We enjoy them for relaxation. Most people have a drink, have a glass of wine, maybe make a cocktail, you go out, there's drinks. But just because it's familiar doesn't mean it is trivial. If you happen to be looking at a slide now, you'll be seeing that spirits segment revenue was $409,559 million in 2022. It's been going up for a while. Whiskey, both in volume and value, has been on a bit of a rampage lately. And the drivers of all of this are urbanization. More than 20 years ago, the entire globe switched. Because about 20 years ago, we went from less than 50% of the world's population living in cities to just over 50%. And that urbanization is driving drinking. Another factor is the rising incomes in Latin America, the Middle East and Africa, and Asia Pacific. All the economic growth, significant economic growth for the globe for the next 50 years is going to come from these regions. Mature markets like Europe and North America will continue to be very significant, but their growth will slow all the way down. The big jumps are going to come from Latin and South America, Africa, and Asia. And the third major driver is a move towards premium and craft. In fact, as we'll see later, an emphasis on premium spirits is what has driven the company Diageo to be the largest and most successful spirits company that the world has ever known. A sort of a subset of that is craft. This occurred first in wine, then in beer, and it's currently happening in spirits. A return to the smaller, older ways, the local person making your beer, your wine, your whiskey, your vodka, maybe your Geneva, some kind of a connection to the buyer. It's very much tied into what's called the experience economy. But however way you look at it, it is and will continue to be a very big driver of growth. Now, all that said, before we get into explaining how the industry works, it's very important that you all know that nobody has a fucking clue. Nobody knows anything. I believe that was actually the title of a memoir written by the famous Hollywood screenwriter William Goldman, and it's true 10 times over in the spirits business. There's a book on the reading list, which you can buy on ypdbooks.com. That's ypdbooks.com, called That Shit Will Never Sell. The H in shit is a little asterisk, by the way. So That Shit Will Never Sell by David Gluckman. David Gluckman is probably the most successful living ideas man for the entire spirits business. He came up with the ideas for Ciroc vodka, for Tanqueray 10 gin, but most famously for Bailey's liqueur, the single most significant best-selling spirits launch in the last 100 years probably, and also, this is less well known, one of the most lucrative. And when they were testing the product out, David flew over to America from his base in London and presented it to the buyer of a mega chain of stores in America. And this guy tastes it and he goes, ha, that shit will never sell. We could spend the rest of this seminar just talking about stupid ideas that were pushed by drinks companies and amazing ideas that almost never made it. The real thing is, nobody really knows. And this is where the science of marketing clashes with the art of brand creation. For instance, if you're looking at the slides now, you'll be seeing a bottle of Unicorn Tears gin created by a kitschy website in England a few years ago. Like, ha 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 ha. Unicorn Tears gin. These gimmicky gins now sell up to 50,000 cases a year. You want some Jaffa Cake gin? They got it. Nobody knows anything. The next slide, for our listeners, shows on the left Tito's vodka. Now, in my day job, when I'm not displaying the fact that I really do have a face for radio, I'm a brand consultant and I try to help brands get on the market, educate and connect, particularly with the on-premise, and educate. And a client came to me not long ago. They had a product in a different category, not vodka, and they're like, okay, we want to revamp this, want you to help us out. And I said, okay, so what does success look like to you? And they said, well, we want to be the Tito's vodka of this category. And I said, well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is I can do this, and it's not going to cost you much money at all. The bad news is it's going to take 23 years, because that's how long Tito's has been around. And for at least 17 years, everyone laughed at them. First, it was the idea of vodka in America that was laughable. Then the idea of vodka in Texas. Then it was the fact that it didn't look, glitzy enough market. It wasn't gold or shiny. They didn't push it in nightclubs. Then they were criticized for being borderline racist just because they were proud of being made in America. And eventually, after everyone had had a good laugh, everyone realized that Tito's was $1 billion business. Nobody knows anything. Right next to Tito's on the slide is something that everyone will be familiar with, which is Hendrick's Gin. Hendrick's, everyone loves it. I doubt anyone has given a marketing presentation in the last 20 years that doesn't reference Hendrick's. Its marketing, largely outsourced, by the way, to the Philadelphia agency, Quaker City Mercantile, is absolutely top-notch. But here's the thing. The brand is almost 20 years old as I record this in 2022, and it lost money for at least 15 of those years. Nobody knows that. It's just not a thing that's out there. Hats off to the Grant family who kept the faith and poured that money in there decade after decade. It's a success now. It's broken even. It's making money, in fact. It's definitely helped redefine the gin category. But nobody knows anything, and the Grants family have big balls. That's why when you see innovation, we've got some bottles on the slide here. We've got a hybrid cross between tequila and mezcal because, oh, okay, why the fuck not? There's even a hybrid cross between Dutch Genever and tequila called Dutch Genquila. Whatever, who knows? Whenever I see these things, I laugh because every now and then one of these things makes it big. And the fact that there is innovation in the spirits category is a very good thing, because it means that spirits are on the rise. Now, some innovations, like the beautiful bottles displayed on the current slide, are genius. That, of course, is my brand, Old Duff Geneva, the best real Dutch Geneva in the world. But perhaps that's something for another presentation. Other ones are so obvious. When Tuttletown Distilling in upstate New York launched Hudson Baby Bourbon and promoted themselves as the first distillery in New York State in 100 years or whatever it was, which they were, it was amazing because it was a little bottle, a $3.75, for the price of a $7.50. And it was a genius way to stand out on the crowded back bars of the world. I actually bought the first bottles that were available in the Netherlands when the brand was being launched at a whiskey festival in Paris. And I put them on our back bar of the first ever speakeasy in Holland, the first ever Dutch bar to get in the world's 50 best bars. And that weekend, customers came in and looked terrified at the back bar, as they normally did. And then they would light on this little bottle and they would say, I want that. And I would say, do you even know what that is? And they're like, no, but I want that little bottle. That is why some innovations are genius. Now, it's important to realize that the big boys dominate. In the annual list called the Millionaires List, published by the Drinks International magazine on drinksint.com, it's a list of the roughly 145 or so brands that sell more than 1 million 9-liter cases every year. And it's probably worth mentioning now that in drinks industry terms, a case might not be what you think a case is. You might think a case is 6 bottles, right? But actually, it's the equivalent of 9 liters. So it's roughly equivalent to 12 750 ml bottles or 12 700 ml bottles, which is what most of the world uses. And of those 143 brands, 32 of them are owned by Diageo. The next biggest company of million case brands is Pernod Ricard with 19, and Beam Suntory is in third place with just 9. When you look at how it is in the drinks business, the Diageos really dominate. Then there's a Pernod and a Campari and a Suntory, and then there might be a few companies that you don't really recognize that well, right? Like La Martiniquaise. But at the top, it's all the normal players, the runners and riders. But if you zoom out a bit and you look at the larger drinks industry, the biggest drinks company in the world is actually AB InBev, the company that was founded as a juggernaut from the merger of the Brazilian Ambev with the Belgian Interbrew and the American Anheuser-Busch. Go anywhere in the world, drink 4 different beers, and AB InBev owns one of them. Actually, they own a little more than one of them because they have 27% of the global beer market. Just to compare it, Diageo only has 10% of the global spirits market. AB InBev is so big, they could buy the next 2 largest drinks companies, which are respectively Coca-Cola and Pepsi, without taking out a loan. They could buy the top 3 spirits companies, Diageo, Pernod, Suntory, with the amount of beer that they spill on a normal day. They're big, is what I'm saying. And what do we drink as people? Well, it's really simple. We drink whiskey, we drink vodka, and we drink Korean soju. Now, you might not have drunk a lot of Korean soju lately. It's a column distilled spirit, very much like a vodka, totally different to the traditional Japanese shochu, different animal, typically a pot distilled thing. But lots of Koreans drink soju. And the whole world drinks whiskey. One of the most whiskey drinking countries in the entire world is India, for instance. But don't confuse volume with value. You can sell 90 million bottles cheap, or you could sell 10 million bottles expensive. The most valuable category of spirits is actually Chinese Baijiu, which is fermented for up to 8 years. And when I say it's got a powerful flavor, that's the biggest understatement I'm making all day. The average Baijiu sells for $300 a bottle. So Baijiu is the most valuable category out there, followed by whiskey and then vodka and rum and a host of other ones. So what is the drinks industry? It's like the old saying, there's no government, there's just us. Well, the drinks industry is the people who make it, the producers, the people who sell it, the marketers, and then the people that they sell it to. First distributors, then wholesalers, and then shops and bars. Now, if you're looking at the slides now, you'll see on the left one of the ugliest distilleries that has ever fired up the stills. The Cooley Distillery in Dundalk, County Louth in Ireland, where I actually went to college for the first 2 years of my college. I didn't go to college in the distillery. That would be a bit too much. I happened to go to college in that town. It was part of an initiative in the 1920s whereby the Irish state hired a Czech-born Soviet architect to design about 8 industrial distilleries around Ireland. The idea was that farmers in the off-season, when they weren't planting or harvesting or whatever it is that farmers do, they could work in the distillery and distill their agricultural waste into industrial alcohol. And the distillery looks like it was designed by a 1920s Czech Soviet architect. It is incredibly ugly, and it makes some of the most beautiful whiskey that has ever been poured into a bottle. On the right, you'll see 2 cheerful chaps in a distillery in Mexico. I know which one it is. I won't actually say it. Whereas one of them's actually in the fermenting tun, and the other one is dumping in a load of agave fiber. This is sort of a metaphor for how distilleries are. Some of them look like operating theaters. Some of them are, shall we say, a little bit more rustic. You want to have open air and wooden vats, for instance, if you're fermenting with wild yeast, because you kind of want a place for the yeast to live. But if you have your own yeast to ferment with, you want it to be pretty sterile to keep the other yeast out and your yeast in. I guess what I'm saying is, this is where stuff is made. And there's 2 kinds of distilleries that make stuff. There's distilleries that make stuff for whoever asks them to do it. These are third-party distilleries. They don't sell their own brands. You go to them and say, I want an Irish whiskey, or I want a gin, or I want a vodka. And they'll say, cool, what do you want? And they'll help you make it. You'll choose a label and a bottle and a closure and a box, and they'll make the stuff. They'll bottle it for you. They'll put it in your box, and that's it. What you want, they'll give it to you. Then there are distilleries that make the stuff that they're going to sell. So, for instance, a Pernod Ricard distillery will make Pernod Ricard whiskey or Pernod Ricard cognac that Pernod Ricard is going to market and sell. It's an integrated supply chain. Not every place that is amazing at making stuff is amazing at selling it. The next step is a little closer to my heart, because it is my university qualification after all, which is to say marketing. And I love the cartoon we have on the slide here, which is from the Scott Adams Dilbert cartoon, which is somebody said, maybe I could try marketing. And his colleague said, that's just liquor and guessing. And he's not totally wrong. Marketing grew up in the USA in the 1920s after the foundation of one of the first management schools, the Kellogg School of Management, founded by a former executive at the Ford Motor Company. And most of what we know about modern business management and marketing did come from America. And the marketing approach was different to the previous approach in the spirits industry. The previous approach was what was called the production approach, whereby you make the stuff as well as you can for the specified cost of goods, you add on a standard percentage for profit, and you incentivize salesmen, and it was usually men, to go out and sell it. And if they couldn't sell it, either the salesmen were incompetent or the customers were stupid. This works well when it works, but when it doesn't work, you wind up with a whiskey lake and surpluses. This is what happened, by the way, to Scotch whiskey when they failed to see where people's tastes were changing in the 1980s, the famous whiskey lock surplus. Marketing is very difficult to define, but at the same time, it's very easy. The best definition I ever heard was selling products that don't come back to customers that do. You go out and spend a lot of time trying to work out what it is that customers want, and then you work out a way to make it and sell it to them at a profit. A big change in the drinks business was when producers and or marketers went from being family companies to being professional companies. Let me expand on that a little bit. This will be familiar if you've ever seen the television series Mad Men about advertising in the 1960s and 70s. One of the characters there is Roger Sterling, and he's like the sort of senior account manager. He knows every head bartender, every head waiter, every brothel madam, every cab driver. He can get tickets for any sporting event. He's the guy that everybody wants to hang out with. And drinks companies, until the 1970s, all had a Roger Sterling. It was usually the CEO's somewhat alcoholic younger brother or something of that nature, maybe a family member in any case. But then, as we'll see later with management consultants and MBA fervor, all those companies were slimmed down. And suddenly, there was no Roger Sterling. And the thing is, the Roger Sterlings weren't totally useless. As well as buttering up clients, they would serve as a sort of a finishing school for all the young men, and it was usually men back then, unfortunately, who came into the company. They would be well brought up young men who'd been to the right schools and gone to the right universities, but, they didn't know how to butter up a client. They didn't know the head waiter at the Waldorf Astoria or the Ritz. They didn't know the buyer for Milroy's or whatever, and Roger Sterling would introduce these young men to all of that and instruct them all in his ways. This movement from family owned, therefore able to plan for the long term, able to pour money into a failing brand, as the Grants family did with Hendrix for many, many years, was a sea change. And the most important change was that when you become a stock market listed company or you take on any kind of debt, you have to present regular results. It might be every 3 months. And everybody wants a tidbit. Every investor wants to be reassured. When the reality is, especially when you're making things that might take 5 or 8 or 10 or 12 years to come to the market, a long-term view is more indicated. There's a beautiful quote. It was actually a tweet from David Wondrich about the 1960s and 70s in the British drinks industry. And bear in mind, the British drinks industry dominated the world. They were the largest drinks companies in the world then, and with Diageo, they still are. And David, the spirits and cocktail historian, said, "The British drinks industry strikes me as having been such a very strange place at the time. A mix of Fleet Street liquid lunchers, regimental tie retreads, and terribly sharp young men, all pulling in money with both hands while their world crumbled around them unnoticed." He's not wrong. Those marketers went from being privately owned companies, very often family owned, to publicly listed. So they were thrown into the bear pit of compliance, regulation, and most of all, quarterly earnings reports and the sacrificial wheeling out of the CEOs who answer to the press and the shareholders. A major thing happened in England in 1986 under the then Margaret Thatcher's Prime Minister Conservative government. They deregulated stock market trading. They allowed the foreign ownership of English brokerages. They allowed electronic trading, and they eliminated fixed price commissions. It was called the Big Bang. And what that meant was England laid the foundations of becoming the global financial trading powerhouse that it is now. It arguably exceeds even New York. And that meant there was a lot of money flying around and a lot of deals to be made. And as we'll see, that kind of led to where we are now. Now, here's a little case study of shareholder and market pressures. The less youthful of you will remember that there was a global financial crash in 2009. And big ticket, fancy, conspicuous consumption vodkas like Grey Goose were suddenly booking 0% growth, as was Absolute. Absolute was a premium back then. But in that same year, 2009, Svedka, a very nice, reasonably priced vodka, suddenly went up 39%. And the received wisdom was that people were trading down. Instead of buying Grey Goose, they were buying Svedka. Now, anybody with half a brain would know that this was just a knee-jerk reaction, and that when the economy bounces back, everything will be back to normal. But unfortunately, CEOs have to face the wolves every 3 months. So, barely a year later, as you'll see on the next slide, Diageo created a Me Too to Svedka, with the same kind of bottle shape, the same kind of colouring, and crucially, the same kind of pricing and vaguely Swedish vibe about it, called rock vodka, with two of those umlaut type things over the I. Now, you've never heard of rock vodka, and you didn't hear of the backup Plan B brand they also created in 2010, Magic Mountain Vodka. No, I'm sorry, Moon Mountain Vodka. But here's the thing. Diageo sunk at least $10 million into each of those brands. That's $20 million straight down the toilet. And as much as we're going to criticize big companies, everyone knew that was money straight down the toilet. Nobody had any realistic vision that rock vodka or Moon Mountain would ever become anything other than a temporary shield for the CEO to hold up to ravenous shareholders and financial media at the quarterly reports. I've got a bottle of rock here, by the way. If you're ever in New York and you fancy trying it, it's fine. Another example is big companies buying into mezcal, because mezcal is really, really hot, especially artisanal, special mezcal. It's increasing at a rate of knots. Bartenders love it. The media love it. Everyone in Brooklyn drinks it. It's a bartender shot. Amazing. But here's the thing. If you're a big company, like Bacardi, who bought Ilegal, like Pernod Ricard, who bought Del Maguey, like Diageo, who've got their fingers in Mezcal Union and Pierre de Almes, and even Casamigos, which has a mezcal too. You're not good at creating brands anymore. What you're really good at is scaling them. You've got the money to build distilleries and make them bigger, and you've got, most magically, the distribution pipes and the armies of salespeople on the ground to go out and sell the shit out of this stuff. But the whole point of mezcal is that it's small scale. Nobody really wants to buy mezcal from a guy who's got like a massive distillery and a Porsche in his driveway. They kind of want to buy mezcal from a very poor farmer in a very remote part of Mexico. And if that farmer is suddenly rich, well, it's just a bit weird. We're in the infancy of mezcal globalizing, but all these big companies buying into mezcal, it kind of looks like they just want to show off at the quarterly earnings reports to me. Now, a big part of marketers is consultants. They love consultants and agencies because it helps them cover their arse. And it's worth talking about them because consultants have been at the birth of the modern drinks industry. It's almost time to start our case study. I did promise you this. Consultants include, of course, the famous Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, and Bain. We'll be hearing more from Bain. Now, case study commencing. You've probably heard of Guinness, the famous black porter beer, founded in Ireland, as is so often the case, by a non-Irish person, an English person actually, Arthur Guinness, in 1759. The visual, by the way, is from a short video that was made. It was never released as an ad for Guinness. I think it was actually made by an agency on spec who wanted the Guinness business. But if you look it up on YouTube, you'll have a giggle. Now, Guinness quickly became massively popular and lucrative, so much so that its founders became literally part of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. The Earl of Ivy, whoever he is, it has to be a he unfortunately, has a seat on the board of Diageo. And we're talking multiple castles in Ireland kind of rich. Simultaneously, in 1877, a company was formed called DCL, the Distillers Company Limited. And this more than anything, because Guinness is a component of modern day Diageo, but so is DCL. DCL kind of became the spiritual backbone of what Diageo is today. People say that General Motors is a finance company that is forced to make cars because it actually makes more money by selling financing for cars than it does from actual selling cars. The same was kind of true of DCL. It was a finance company that owned distilleries, and it was run like a finance company. They were ruthless, buying up capacity, closing down over capacity, bringing products out at the right price. It wasn't a marketing company, it was a finance company. And separately, in England in 1934, a company was created that came to be called Grand Metropolitan. It was initially a hotel company. It branched out into catering. And then when it began acquiring more and more bars and restaurants and hotels and properties, it became kind of a property company. And when it had bought enough of them, it found itself in possession of distilleries. You can probably see where this is going to lead. There's a picture of a cow on the slide with Grand Met, by the way, because it was Grand Met that actually created Bailey's. They owned a distillery in Ireland, Gilbey's, and they also owned a dairy in Ireland, right? So we're talking whiskey, milk, and there were massive subsidies being granted by the government in Ireland for exports. So they brought that dilemma to David Gluckman, and they said, look, cream, whiskey, can you do anything with it? And he and his partner created Bailey's. But let's move on. In 1981, Guinness was, and I don't want to overwhelm you with technical language here, fucked. It was in a bad way. Its market cap, what you would get if you bought back every share, was $239 million, which was not good. And the real reason was, it was a family business, Guinness. Every family member had a seat on the board, and every family member had a pet project. There were Guinness river cruises in Germany. There was Guinness chocolates. There was Guinness movie production in Hollywood. And they were all bleeding money except for the core business of Guinness, as it were. This was not a good thing. So, the Earl of Ivy hired in 1981 Ernest Saunders. Now, Ernest Saunders was the kind of guy that got hired to run family businesses. In fact, he had been hired by Nestle, the Swiss conglomerate, and he had risen to the very top, or at least as far as he could ever go, and it was gently pointed out to him that he would never get the top job because he wasn't French or Swiss. So he was lured away by the Guinness family, and he was himself not of the aristocracy, but he'd been to the right schools and the right colleges, and he also had an expertise in something back then that was required, that was, in Europe, viewed with about as much credibility as witchcraft, which is to say, marketing. Now, Ernest had it hard at Guinness because he comes in, the core business of black beer is doing very, very well. Everything else is bleeding money. That's why the company is in trouble. And he is not an Ivy. He's not a member of the Guinness family. And he's faced with the idea of having to fire as many as a dozen family members. So, not being stupid, he thought, I probably need a hatchet man. So he tried to hire the McKinsey consulting company, but they were already busy in the UK with a project for a different brewery. And he said to McKinsey, well, if you're number one, who's number two? And they said, well, there is a new consultancy called Bain. So he hired Bain. He personally hired Eric Bain and set him to work. And both McKinsey and Bain were stringent proponents of a new form of doing business, a scientific, mathematical way that came to be embodied with the new qualification, the MBA, whereby you look at everything stripped of all emotion. You spend 90% of your time on the brands that bring in 90% of your revenue, and you allocate the rest of your time accordingly. Bain got rid of all those family members. With a minimum of fuss, Ernest was able to survive all that transition, the numbers went up, and everybody was happy. Until, of course, Bain did what Bain does. They said, okay, with the equivalent of 1980s PowerPoints, You're not just a beer company. You are a share of throat company. You are a drink company. You should buy Bell's, which at the time was the best-selling Scotch whisky in Scotland and England. And Ernest was convinced. So they tried to buy Bell's. It was a real battle because Bell's was part of Scotland. The Scottish were fiercely protective of it. Ernest Saunders got death threats. His marriage almost dissolved. Sleepless nights. Everything. But eventually, Guinness bought Bell's. Brilliant, thought Ernest. Excellent. High fives all round. Let's all have a glass of champagne and some whiskey. Unfortunately, not. The Bain consultants took old Ernest, into whom they now had their hooks deep, to lunch at the Connaught in London's Mayfair. And they said, I'm sorry, Ernest, now you've got a problem. And he said, what the fuck? I mean, I don't know if he actually said that, but I'm sure that's what he felt. They're like, well, now you're big enough to be a target for takeovers, but you're not big enough to protect yourself. And he was like, fuck me. Again, I don't know that he actually said that, but I'm pretty sure that was the sentiment. So essentially, Bain talked Ernest into buying DCL. Now, this is like a minnow swallowing a shark. DCL was much, much, much bigger. And what happened was Ernest and a couple of other company directors cooked up a scheme whereby they would buy Guinness shares and Guinness would guarantee any losses on them buying the shares. So if they bought Guinness shares and the shares went back, Guinness would repay them. This would inflate Guinness's share price so it could borrow enough money to buy DCL. Now, remember I told you about the deregulation, all the money flooding around. This is also the time of the 1980s, real Wolf of Wall Street type stuff. Insider trading wasn't technically illegal back then, and indeed, this Guinness DCL deal involved the famous, and later convicted, junk bond king Ivan Boesky in America. The long and the short of it was that Guinness did buy DCL. Unfortunately, Ernest and three of the other people involved were sentenced to jail sentences for several years for their part in what is called the Guinness affair. Ernest got out after a couple of years on the grounds that he had early onset Alzheimer's. It was the first case ever where Alzheimer's was used for mitigation. And it was also the first time ever, a few years after he was released, that he was declared cured of Alzheimer's. So make of that what you will, but Guinness and DCL became Guinness UDV, a very big, very major player. And then Guinness UDV merged with Grand Met to become Diageo. Now, the name Diageo, there are many, many explanations for it. There are t-shirts and explanations. It means of the earth, from the people, for the wind, all this kind of thing. However, many of the older Diageo staff were at a global conference in Italy whereby the then CEO came downstairs after a strategy session and said, hey, here's the new name, it's Diageo. So think of that as you want to. In 2001, something even more cataclysmic happened. The largest drinks company previously, before Guinness UDV, was the of Canadian origin Seagram's, founded by Samuel Bronfman, who, when he got a little old, gave control of the company to his son, Edgar Bronfman, and Edgar passed it on to his son, Edgar Bronfman Jr. Now, Seagram's had created global brands such as Chivas Regal, and to this day, Seagram's Gin is the best-selling gin in the USA. It was a big, rich firm, and Samuel Bronfman had become a billionaire, also through very clever investment, such as owning a quarter of the megalithic company DuPont Chemical. But his grandson, Edgar Bronfman, didn't want to be in the drinks business. Oh no. There's a saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, which is to say, one generation earns a fortune from manual labor, the next generation gets to wear, suits and ties, and the third generation loses it and has to go back to manual labor. Well, that's not exactly what happened here, but it's also not what happened. Edgar Bronfman Jr. always wanted to be involved in the entertainment industry from a young age. He wanted to be a movie producer, a singer, songwriter. He wanted to circulate in those areas. So first he sold off his family's mega lucrative holding in DuPont Chemical. And then he sold the entire drinks business. This had never happened before in the modern era. Like, Seagram's had brands like Captain Morgan's and Absolute. It was so big. So Diageo had to coordinate with their next biggest competitor, which was actually Pernod Ricard. And Pernod Ricard were many times smaller then. They were barely a player at all, to be brutally honest. But they had to coordinate to see who got which brand so that you didn't trigger the interest of the Monopolies and Merger Commission, that you didn't get too much of a dominant position in any one category. But they did. And this turbocharged both Diageo and Pernod Ricard. Suddenly, they became truly big global firms. Things like this happen once in a lifetime. In the interim, Diageo got a CEO called Paul Walsh, and Paul Walsh made a very big, very aggressive bet. The board kept him on for 10 years, and his big bet was on premium spirits. At the time, of course, Diageo had beer, it had wine, it still has Guinness, but everybody was telling him, oh, wine's going to continue to be good, beer is going to continue to be good, and he ignored all of them. He gambled quite a bit on high-end single malts, scotches. He gambled a lot on luxury tequila like Don Julio, and his ship came in enormously. As I write, in 2022, the Diageo market cap is $103.4 billion. That means almost a 16% growth rate every year since 1981, or putting it separately, if you had bought $100 worth of Diageo shares in 1981, it would currently be worth $43,314. That's why we're using Diageo as a case study here. It is the largest, most successful drinks company the world's ever seen. Their playbook is the playbook everyone operates off, and it's largely a playbook that was created by Bain Consulting. Let's take another example. In 2003, based on an idea from David Gluckman, Diageo came out with a sort of an answer to Grey Goose, which had been created by the American businessman Sidney Frank, also French, also vodka, also super luxury, called Ciroc. French grape vodka. Gluckman, by the way, wanted it to be super premium American grape vodka. Looking back, might have gone better if he had got his way. But they created it. And the thing with the big companies is, back in the day, they would have a Gluckman in-house. They would create brands, get them to market quickly but inexpensively. And when they succeeded, they owned everything. When they failed, they could be buried quickly. However, with the MBA culture that Bain instigated in Diageo, everybody wants to be the CEO, because why else would you go to all the expense of getting an MBA? And it's not great for your track record if you're in charge of the R&D department, because the R&D department, 95% of all the investment goes straight down the toilet every single year. Every once in a while, maybe you hit a winner. But the other structure of these big companies is that everybody wants to have their say. They want to have their fingerprint on something in case it might be successful. So by the time a product comes to market, 40 people have weighed in on it. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's like the old saying, a giraffe is a horse that was made by a committee. Well, modern drinks companies have way too many committees. Anyway, back to Ciroc. So Diageo created Ciroc, and everybody got their say, and it wasn't a success. So they did do something very innovative. 4 years later, in 2007, it was selling 60,000 cases, which for Diageo is a massive failure. So they hired Sean Combs, better known as Puff Daddy or P. Diddy or whatever he's called this week, and they gave him half the profits for 10 years, which was, of course, initially half of nothing. But Combs was a very sharp businessman. He set up his own promotion agency, all of which he funded out of his own pocket, Blue Smoke Entertainment, to promote Ciroc. as well as some other things. And he paid for all the salaries of those people. He went to bottle signings in nightclubs. He got on phone calls with distributors in Wisconsin. He really, really worked it. By 2008, it was up to 400,000 cases. Let's not forget, Diageo also put in a $16 million promotional budget that isn't often mentioned, right? They kind of had a backup for Sean Combs. And by 2020, it was 1.8 million cases. It's been declining lately, but that is a huge success. It is a very innovative thing that lots and lots of people have tried to copy. Many other drinks companies began giving half their brands to rappers and entertainment people, but they forgot to back it up with the marketing budgets Diageo also kicked in. Because think about it, giving away half the profits for 10 years for something that isn't making any profit, well, that costs you nothing. It's all upside, no downside. Let's talk about the next tier of the drinks business, which is to say the distributors, the wholesalers, the shops and bars. This is where it really gets interesting. Now, to get a bottle available for a liquor store or a bartender to buy, that's $24.99, $25. In America, that's the magical $1 per ounce cost price, right? $1 per 30 ml. That means the distillery's going to make it for about $6 and add on their profit of $6. And then the importer to America is going to add 30%. The distributor is going to add 30%. And then you're going to wind up with the bar or liquor store buying it for $24.99 at their deepest discount. It will be on the liquor shelf for $32.99 for you, a consumer, to buy it, because the shop will put a 30% margin on top of that $24.99. So it'll go out for $32.99. A bar, however, and let's all pause to look at my old friend, the dear departed Gary Regan, finger stirring the first ever Negroni he finger stirred one very warm afternoon in Cognac in France, when we were both there to help run the G-Vine Gin Connoisseur Program World Bartender Finals. I can still remember that drink with Gary's finger in it. Okay, moving on. This is a metaphor for bars, of course. A bar will buy that bottle for $24.99 and they'll sell it for $125, more or less, which is to say just under 17 shots of 1.5 ounces each, 45 mils, at $7.50 each. Yes, I know. I'd love to find a bar that sells 45 mLs for $7.50. I'm lowballing here, right? Just so you get a sense for it. That means the bar will make about $101 on each bottle. That equates to an 80% profit margin. The target for a bar for the whole beverage program is 75%, or as in American terms, they say to have a liquor cost of 25%. So some things that you sell will have a profit margin of maybe 85%, and some of them might have a profit margin of 65%, so long as it all equals out over the whole beverage program to a gross profit GP of 75%, which equates to a liquor cost of 25%. By the way, please do not begrudge a bar that profit margin. I have run and owned bars for most of my life, and I can assure you there's nothing left over in net profit at the end of the year. The average net profit for a hospitality business in the USA is 5%, but most people will tell you never ever get there. All it takes is a broken air conditioner or one flooded bathroom or replacing the fridges, and all that potential profit is all gone. It's a tough business. So we've come to the end of this seminar, but I'm not letting you go without giving you a few recommendations for further learning. I think I'm going to do a few more of these, maybe a US-centric one, an EU-centric one, an Asia-centric one. Please write in, tweet at me at Philip Duff, PHILIPDUFF, Instagram me at Philip S. Duff, PHILIPSDUFF. Email me, philip at liquidsolutions.org, PHILIP at LIQUIDSOLUTIONS.org. But things to sign up to, things to read, free and easy, drinksint.com and their newsletter and their Twitter. This is Drinks International, one of the major trade magazines for the spirits business. And then thespiritsbusiness.com and their email newsletter and Twitter. ShankenNewsDaily.com and their newsletter and Twitter. Very American-centric, excellent statistics. And JustDrinks.com and their newsletter and Twitter. Bit more UK-centric. Books. Many of the books I'm going to recommend are not about the spirits industry. For some reason, we don't have as many great ones as we should. But one of the best, covering everything from production to outsourcing to in-housing to working with distributors to being bought, is about a non-alcoholic brand. Oh my God, no, a non-alcoholic brand. Yes, a non-alcoholic brand. Deal with it. It's honest tea. And the book is called Mission in a Bottle. It's brilliant. It is, however, a bit of a pain in the tits because it's a graphic book. You kind of have to read it on an iPad or a laptop. It doesn't kind of translate to reality. But once you get past that, it is gold. That Shit Will Never Sell from David Luckman on ypdbooks.com. That's ypdbooks.com. The H in shit is an asterisk, so it's that S asterisk IT will never sell. Absolute solid gold. Look David Luckman up on LinkedIn. He's always happy to jump on a Zoom with anybody and have a chat with you if you've got a brand or a thought or an idea. A real treasure. The next one is Beer Blast by Philip van Munching. Brilliant, brilliant book. Leo van Munching was a steward on a liner going from Holland to America, and there was a senior executive from the Heineken company on the liner too. This was in the 1920s, before there was airplane flights, and he got to know this van Munching guy because he was the steward and he knew about beer and he spoke English. He was very nice, very charming. And this Heineken executive said, look, I'm going to New York to find an importer distributor for Heineken, but why don't I just give you some money, you get off the boat, and you do it there? And Van Munching's held the exclusive agency for import in America of Heineken for 100 years. Now you might think, whatever, Heineken. But this was essentially the first large premium import beer in America. They created premium beer in America. And everything detailed in this book by Philip, the grandson, is pure gold. It's like looking at a crystal ball in the future as to what's going to happen with spirits. It details the rise of craft beer, which parallels the rise of craft spirits. It talks about dealing with distributors and dealing with threats. It is absolutely fantastic. Similarly to the more recent book, Barrel Aged Stouts and Selling Out, which is a more detailed case study of the Goose Island brewery, which attracted incredible fandom from its birth. It was then sold to the evil empire that is AB InBev, and they, of course, they did what big companies do. They commercialized it and they scaled it up. And this details the entire process of all of that, how everybody felt about it at every different stage, what happened. Cannot talk highly enough about this book. And finally, there's always got to be a unicorn. This is the unicorn. It's probably the best book, but it was only published twice and only in New Zealand, and it's out of print. So I don't know. Ask a Kiwi friend who goes to secondhand stores. But it's called Every Bastard Says No. It's the story of 42 Below Vodka by Justine Troy and Jeff Ross, who founded it. It details every aspect of creating, building, growing, and selling 42 Below Vodka, eventually to Bacardi. And interestingly enough, everyone involved gets a chapter. Their brand ambassadors, salespeople, even the predatory finance guy who swooped in to buy half the company in return for cash flow as they began to grow. And as their sales went up, their cash flow went down. It is utter gold. Everyone who's ever read it agrees on it. But yeah, try to get your hands on it. And finally, that's me. Let me know if you like this. Like, subscribe, touch all my bells and buttons. Tweet at me at Philip Duff. Instagram me at Philip S. Duff. Email me at philip@liquidsolutions.org. And I don't know about you, but after all of this, I definitely need a drink. Thanks for listening.